to talk to you about sex and relationships following brain injury. Obviously it's something us British don't like to talk about, but actually it's something we all love and enjoy. We love relationships and we love sex. So I'm going to talk about how sex and relationships are affected following a brain injury, the importance of consent and capacity around sexual relationships, and also any suggestions and support that might be available for people with brain injury. With any sort of disability, in particular brain injury, there's a lot of adjustment in relationships between partners. It's a very difficult time for both of them. Obviously, maybe apart. One might be living in a, rehab facility while the other one's still coping at home by themselves. But there's also other things that they need to consider, like obviously there's the physical changes that will affect their relationship. They have a change of roles. Communication difficulties will come into play as well. A lot of people with brain injury have a change of personality. So that brings new challenges and fears, and obviously limitations as well. And they may actually feel quite estranged from one another as well, because change of personality, they perhaps don't get on as much as they used to, so they don't really know what to expect from one another either. So I'm just going to look in that, explain that in a few more details. And obviously we also need to bear in mind sort of homosexual, bisexual relationships and people that are not married. That can cause even more problems in that they might not get a say in any sort of health decisions for their partner, and there's a lot of decision making when you're working with people with brain injury. And also they might not get time off work whereas another partner would, just because of the dynamics of that the person's not considered next of kin. So that can create sort of extra stresses around those sorts of relationships as well. So looking in more detail at the physical changes, of course, first of all, you've got the actual damage to the brain that can impact specifically on sexual functioning, like frontal temporal lobe damage, and that can cause a lack of interest or actually an increased interest, which we call disinhibition, or physical ability. They may sort of lack the physical ability, obviously, to perform sexually as well. There's also chemical changes in the brain. We call them neurotransmitters, and there may be too many of them or too little of them. So hormones are affected in the same way. So if they're not working, then that can affect the sex drive and arousal. But in the same way, if there's too much, then you may be, you may be too sexually driven, and perhaps might lead to you being sort of inappropriate, or there may be a difference in what you want compared to what your partner wants. Also need to consider obviously mobility and spasticity, sort of high tone and low tone that affects people with brain injury. They may have slow jerky movements or loss of strength. Stamina can affect balance, things like that as well. So that might lead to a bit of awkwardness during sex. People may be self-conscious because you may have a client that's got quite a high-toned limb. Just the practical things like it might just get in the way, things like that really that, just will affect how people feel about each other as well. And also there's obviously the effect of sensation as well. A lot of people with brain injury will have reduced sensation, but they may have increased sensation as well, which will affect their ability to feel or tolerate being touched. Their ability to feel sort of cold and heat is also affected. So all of those things, during sexual acts, can all have an impact on how well that goes really. And it affects all the senses really, like visual problems, hearing and smell as well, which I think a lot of us underestimate, but they all come into play during sort of sexual acts. We also need to consider communication, because obviously that's an important thing in order to develop relationships and express your love and affection. So people with brain injury will often have dysphasia, which is difficulty understanding language and sort of expressing their thoughts may be really difficult. And then there's dysarthria as well, where people physically will have difficulty speaking. So their voice might sound strange, and that alone will reduce their confidence. So all those dynamics, when you're trying to express affection with somebody, or your partner might say they love you, but the person with brain injury might not be able to immediately respond to that, and that is likely to have quite an impact on relationships. So it's helping partners understand that it's not necessarily that they don't love the person anymore, that it's just that they're not able to communicate that. Another important physical difficulty following brain injury is fatigue, and it's a very, people often underestimate how much fatigue affects all sorts of activities of daily living, but obviously, sex is usually quite an active pastime, so that has a huge impact. They'll have reduced physical strength, stamina, and it's not just a physical fatigue. People with brain injury will have mental fatigue as well, because all the attention and just having to concentrate on so many things that will have an impact. They may appear that they're completely not interested, but actually, again, that's just that they're so mentally fatigued. So tiredness can be, a real problem. Another thing to consider is pain. A lot of people with brain injury have neurological pain, or just because they've got so many physical difficulties, that may have an impact on other parts of their body, which cause sort of referred pain. So obviously, if somebody's in pain, that's going to affect their mood and their sexual desire, as it does for all of us really when we're not feeling ourselves. We also need to consider incontinence. A lot of people with brain injury are unable to control their bowels or their bladder, and again, that can lead to embarrassment around that, or fear of having an accident during sex, and just not feeling attractive because you can't control your bladder and your bowel. Really can have an impact on partners' relationships. And also, actually, if you're living at home, your partner that was your sexual partner may be the person that's helping you with your incontinence problems, so that can affect you, feeling like a sexual being as well. Another consideration is medication. A lot of people with brain injury take medications for many reasons, usually to prevent seizures, treat mood difficulties and help them to sleep, and unfortunately all of those types of medications do have an effect on drive and arousal, and people's ability to obtain sort of erection and orgasm, so that can have an impact. Other aspects we need to consider are sort of psychosocial, which is sort of a combination of sort of our thinking and our feeling and our memory and our sort of high-level thinking skills, and how they interact with our social interactions. So looking at cognitive impairment, obviously brain injury will affect the way you think, your attention, memory, planning ahead, reasoning. You might be unable to focus, and it seems like to the outside that you're bored or not interested, whereas actually that's not really the case. It's just how you're perceived. Obviously, brain injury affects your memory, like you might miss dates, or you might have sex with your partner, but within an hour or even less than that, have no memory that you've actually undertaken that act whatsoever. So obviously that could lead to some frustrations on both parts. Your thinking difficulties, during sex, we're quite often, thinking about other things while we're undertaking the task, or, previous encounters we might have had, or, sometimes you might be fantasising about things while you're having sex. So that, is part of helping you get excited. So if your thinking skills affected, then, that may also have an impact on your ability to enjoy sexual relationships. Planning, so obviously you might make a date with your partner and potentially forget that you've made that date, or even sort of planning and sequencing the steps involved in the task of having sex, forgetting the order of how you do things, that can all have an impact on that. With a lot of people with brain injury, motivation and initiation, so their ability to start activities can be affected, and it will be affected. For example, it may affect their standards of personal care, like their hygiene. They might not take a shower as often as they used to. They might forget to clean their teeth. And obviously, that can have an impact on sexual relationships if you're a little bit more unkempt than you used to be. And there would be subtle changes about, being able to monitor your own appearance, might change your dress sense. I mean, a lot of people haven't got any dress sense, but it is one of the things that can be affected through a brain injury, and also colour coordination as well. As we said before, people with brain injury may be, some people may be disinhibited, so they may be a bit less diplomatic when they're, or offend people by saying or doing something that might be inappropriate with regards to sort of sexual sort of innuendo, like for example expressing an interest in someone that they've only just met in the street. Sort of expressing sort of a sexual explicit sort of approach to somebody, and obviously in some extreme cases this may lead to sort of even being arrested for that sort of behaviour in public. Some of the physical difficulties that I've explained before may lead to obviously a feeling of reduced confidence, and they might feel affected by their body image, because obviously their body image has changed, and that will also affect a person's self-esteem. They probably be self-conscious of the physical and cognitive thinking difficulties that they've got. With a lot of people with brain injury, they're not always obvious. Certainly the cognitive difficulties are not always obvious. So they may feel like they're not attractive to other people, and they might keep themselves to themselves, and actually as a result of that they may not reach out as often as before to actually socialise outside of people that they knew prior to their brain injury. Something else that affects relationships following brain injury is a change in the roles within a relationship. Each of the partners, whether it be the person with the brain injury or the unaffected partner, may have to give up previous roles and might have to learn new ones. So for example, maintaining the home, finances, looking after the children, managing health difficulties. It can be quite stressful for both parties having to adjust to these new changes, and if the person with the brain injury is in rehabilitation, then obviously the partner has to take on all of those roles, which makes them a lot more stressed, and they're having to do more at home but also supporting their partner who's having rehab at the moment. So that can all affect them, and it's quite a period of adjustment for people. And sometimes people might think that it's just a temporary adjustment, and then obviously once the person with the brain injury returns home, that again can be quite overwhelming, because there can be an assumption that the person with the brain injury is just going to immediately resume the roles that they had previously, but that can take some time. And obviously sometimes people can't return to their previous roles at all. Brain injury, obviously, for all the factors that I've already outlined, people have sort of decreased social contact. They might be in a rehabilitation facility, or when they go home they might not be able to return to work, or some of the social activities or leisure activities that they used to do. So sometimes they can quite often find that they're quite isolated, and that's a problem even if you've got a partner. But if you haven't got a partner prior to your brain injury, then obviously that has a huge impact, because it will really reduce the social outlets that person comes into contact with. Sometimes they're not able, as a person with a brain injury doesn't have contact with old friends, as they don't want to return to old habits, because a lot of people with brain injury had sort of alcohol and drug habits prior, so they make the conscious choice that they don't want to go back to their old friends. So again, that really reduces their social interactions. Also, friends may not always understand how a person with brain injury has changed, so that will potentially decrease social relationships, and obviously decrease in social relationships and interaction will affect opportunities for sexual contact as well, will be a lot less. All of the areas that I've outlined, obviously they'll contribute to sort of a lot of frustration for somebody with brain injury. The lack of social contact will also increase sort of low mood, or exacerbate sort of any negative behaviours, not only because of the brain injury, but they'll have to make a huge amount of adjustments across their whole life. So their mood will, is likely to be low, and that again, that really impacts on anyone's desire to have a sexual relationship, and it can lead to antisocial behaviour. So it's sort of quite cyclical really, because they're low because they haven't got the social contact, but they don't want to go and seek the social contact either, because they're very conscious about themselves following their brain injury. We all have to have the ability to say yes or no to a sexual relationship, and it'll be an offence if somebody says no for anybody to carry on with that. It becomes a bit more difficult when somebody's had a brain injury, because especially if they have difficulty making decisions or with their thinking skills. So if, as a team, we believe a person lacks the ability to make that sort of decision for themselves, we're legally obliged to ensure that they do have capacity to make that decision. Unlike other capacity assessments that usually come under the Mental Capacity Act, consent for sexual relationships actually comes under the Sex Offences Act. And the reason, in ordinary circumstances for other consents, if we feel that somebody does not have capacity, then normally that would go to a best interest meeting where a team of people would come together and make a decision on that person's behalf. But the reason it doesn't come under that act is because no one can decide for somebody else whether or not they can have sex with somebody. So that's why it's covered under the Sex Offences Act. So how we go about undertaking capacity is we would sit down with that person, and we need to assess a few different things for sexual capacity. We need to assess whether they understand what the act is, what the effect of that act might be, so any potential difficulties around sexually transmitted infections, any sort of potential pregnancies. So the way we assess capacity for a sexual relationship is that obviously everybody's assumed to have capacity unless it's established that they lack capacity. We have to do the test. It has to be a decision-specific test, and it has to be done at the relevant time. We need to consider if the person has an impairment. So obviously, not everybody with a brain injury will have an impairment, but if they have one about how their mind is affected and about decision making, then we probably need to consider a capacity assessment. Someone may be deemed to lack capacity following assessment if they do not have an understanding and awareness of the mechanics of the act, the health risks involved, such as sexually transmitted infections or obviously potential pregnancies, and they need to also lack an understanding that they have a choice to refuse the sexual contact. If they are deemed to lack capacity, obviously, like I said before, we wouldn't move on to have a best interest meeting. So if the person is deemed to lack capacity, then no one can lawfully have sex with that person. Even if somebody is deemed to have capacity, but we feel as a team, or it's reported to us that we feel people are being put under pressure to engage in a sexual activity, then a safeguarding referral can also be made. So obviously I've talked about all the difficulties following brain injury with regard to sexual relationships, roles and partners and everything. I'd now like to look at sort of any support that could maybe be offered to people with brain injury with regards to their relationships. Obviously, if you're within sort of a facility, a rehabilitation facility, you can talk to the team, or even if you're in the community and you're still being supported by rehabilitation staff, you can talk to the team. They might be able to signpost you to sort of education programs or help you with sort of stress relieving activities. There's an option for a medical examination to see if there's any sort of potential physical causes for particular difficulties. The therapy team can help concentrate on areas such as range of motion, strength, endurance. Speech and language therapy can obviously help with communication difficulties, and psychologists can help you improve problems with your sort of social communication, maybe learning to take turns, how to ask appropriate questions, making good eye contact, that sort of thing. And you can get help with, existing or potential, new relationships by talking to the therapy team. You'll need to consider sort of minimising fatigue, so maybe choosing the best time of day for a sexual relationship when you're less physically tired, and also when you're less mentally tired as well. So, it might be an option, to have sex in the morning. That works for, can work for a lot of people. Maybe you can consider that your partner can perform more of the physical activity, or restrict sex to maybe shorter episodes so that you can both enjoy it. You can consider the environment, if you are in a rehabilitation facility, maybe you can be afforded some privacy when your partner visits, a quiet room, obviously even at home, maybe make sure there's less distractions, maybe plan ahead so that you know that it's going to be calm and quiet and that you're both in a, relaxed and, less tired state, and that you don't rush rush things. So try not to have a limited time frame so that you can take your time. Obviously, with regards to your sort of thinking cognitive skills, you can, write dates for sex in your diary, or if you're, meeting somebody, or a partner could remind you about any of your previous sexual activities that you've had. If you are going to forget within a short space of time, maybe you can have a way of, writing it in a diary, or it depends how you feel, or with all the modern technology, you could film yourself talking about your previous sexual activity with your partner. Having a sense of humour about these things help, and as I said before, being British doesn't help sometimes because we don't like to talk about all this. And also I talked about drugs, things like that, so obviously you can discuss that with your doctor as well to see whether or not any of your drugs can be adjusted if that is found to be having a particular impact on your sexual functioning as well. Now looking at obviously social interaction and how you can improve your social interaction. Obviously, if you're invited to a social event, try and say yes, even though you might be feeling sort of low and less inclined to do it. I think everybody appreciates going out and about with friends. We usually benefit from that. Say yes. Obviously, you need to be patient because adjusting to your limitations, to the limitations of your partner will be difficult. So it's important that the person with the brain injury and the partner obviously communicate openly about the difficulties. You could also consider returning to old hobbies or to start new ones, joining a club. Obviously, this may be difficult with people with brain injury for various reasons. Occupational therapy can help a lot to help you return to your old leisure pursuits. You could also consider meeting people with similar interests to you, and there are a lot of community groups for people with brain injury where you can meet other people with brain injury, and that can often be beneficial for partners as well, so that partners can talk to other partners about difficulties with relationships. You could also consider taking on a volunteer role if person with a brain injury, if you previously worked, and then taking on a volunteer role may help with some social interaction as well. Other help available is psychotherapy, obviously counselling, either for the person with the brain injury, or obviously you can go to counselling together as a couple. And there are obviously licensed sex therapists available who can help people overcome sort of sexual difficulties. Feeling sexually satisfied is an important part quality of life for everybody. So, perhaps you need to consider, masturbation or self-pleasuring if, you're finding, having sex with your partner difficult. That's another way for you to, feel satisfied, really. And the use of sexual media, DVDs, magazines, there's some legal online forums as well that you can use. We've talked about sex. I hope you found this an informative topic. It is something that we don't talk about very much, and we should a lot more. Acquired brain injury has a significant impact on a person's life, and we shouldn't shy away from talking about sex because it is an important part for everybody. If you've got any difficulties, please approach staff that are supporting you, or even a relative if you don't want to talk to staff directly. If you're having difficulties. I hope this has gone some way to help you understand this difficulty and given you some ideas going forward.